Hello and welcome to class 6. In this class, what I want to do is use the shot that we have to create some new particles that might work either in conjunction or in lieu of these dust passes that we had added before in the previous shot or in the previous class. So to do that, we're going to go through a process where we actually look at this plate here and try to establish some 3D environment and creating a ground plane and also kind of simulate the rough shape of the car as it's falling down on top of the guy. Now, in the shot to do that, one of the best ways to get started is to actually undistort the plate. So we're just going to go through this very quickly using the lens distortion node. So just to let you know, I've got a frame hold here at 414, and this is off of the original plate. And in frame 414, you'll notice that the main guy here actually steps away from the shot. Now you'll notice that there's a slight shift in the plate itself, but I think that that's nothing more than just a focus change and not actually a change in the focal length of the lens. A few things about this, which we'll go down further, is that we don't have any camera information, so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. But first thing we'll do is create a lens distortion node and try and undistort the plate. To do this effectively, what we want to do is use the line analysis. If there are other ways to analyze a plate, but since this is a lock-off, this is going to be the only way we can really get any decent data to undistort the plate or flatten it out. So in using this, I'm going to break this away. Whoops. I'm going to break this away from the control panels and then just expand the viewer here so we can actually work in a little bit larger canvas. So to do this, what we're going to do is turn the drawing mode on, and basically what we do is draw a series of points and create a line from that. And as I'm doing it, I'll just kind of talk a little bit about how I go about doing this sort of thing. So what you need to look for are straight lines. So now that I have drawing mode on, I'm just going to click in the viewer and click here and click here. After I've done that, I have 3 points. If I hit the right mouse button, it creates a line. Now look at that line and make sure it actually looks straight and it looks like it's adequately following what you think is a straight edge, because that's actually pretty important in this case. Then we'll move on and try to get another one here. So we've got one here and one here. And let's try one. Let's go right here. And it helps to zoom in and just make sure that your lines are actually accurate. If you make a mistake, which I'll demonstrate, so we'll create one here, 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 and here. So I got 4 points here. You can always take these before they've been laid out to being a line and just kind of drag. You won't see them dragging with the mouse, which is a little odd, but that's okay. As long as you get close, then that's great. In this case, this one I don't like where it's placed at all, so I'm just going to delete the last point. And then this one, I'll actually move this up to about here. So, and then this seems to be a little off kilter as well. And then maybe we'll just add one more right here and then right click. And, you know, to be honest, this feels like it bows a little bit. So I'm just going to delete the last line. And this is actually kind of the process for which I go to making this work correctly, because it's not always easy to tell when the line is straight, but you really do need these lines to be straight to get an accurate calculation for your lens distortion. So I've got a few lines here and there. This one here looks like a pretty good one because it is actually straight across, it looks like. And a good horizontal line will certainly help this calculate. And once again, it feels like this actually bows upwards a little bit, so I'm going to redo it. And maybe zoom way in, so that way I know that I'm actually getting an accurate placement of these points. And there, okay. Yeah, it still feels a little, yeah, no, actually that looks okay. And then I think I saw another, yeah, there's another one over here. So we can do this one here and get right in there and make sure that it's on. Actually, I'm going to delete this last point and just do this and then one here. I think that's pretty good. We also have, this right here. This definitely is a good one. These are lines that we can safely say are straight lines, which is essentially what you need to do. And then, there's also these over here, which we can get. Let's move that up a little bit. Get these to kind of run the gamut of the shot or the frame, which is always important. And then we also have a few others that we could do. I imagine this pipe right here for this scaffolding or this ladder will work pretty well. It looks like a pretty straight pipe. And then we also have the C-stand in here, which we can use. Now with the C-stand, what I'm going to do is just take where the reflection goes from white to green, because at least we know that the light is refracting in a fairly uniform way. So I think that's going to be pretty good. And we've got what looks like an edge right here. And now that I've done all this, I would say this is probably enough to get an accurate solve for the lens distortion. So we'll do this one right here too. All right, now that we have that, what we'll do is we'll go over here to the lens distortion tab. Oh, excuse me. We'll go over here one more time before we click over and click on Analyze Lines. Now that we've done that, you can see right away that we now have lens distortion being removed from the shot. And actually, we're looking at it before the guy was in and out, but essentially you get the idea. This looks pretty good. I think that this is a good solve for the lens distortion. So now that we have this undistorted plate, let's get started using the model builder to creating basically a ground plane. So there's a few things that need to take place to do this correctly. And the first thing that we need to do to get anything to work is to create a camera. So I'm just going to create a camera. So realistically, this is what we want to do here. And let's zoom in, make sure that we have the right hookup together, which I have actually done a few times where I accidentally hook up the wrong node to the various noodles and ended up with some not so good results. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Moving on to the camera. So when I looked at this shot, and actually what I'm going to do is pause down for one moment and pull up a flip book of this plate. I want to talk a little bit about it. Okay, so here we are. This is the entire plate being played from start to finish. And the things that I wanted to kind of discuss were the fact that this is obviously a very wide lens. And what I'm getting at with that is if you look at how large this guy is and how small he is, and then how much smaller this guy is, that's the result of it's creating a lot of what feels like depth in the shot. And with wide angle lenses, they're going to produce a feeling that the depth is greater. And conversely, when you think about a telephoto lens, if you look at a telephoto lens of somebody that's photographed or shot, you'll notice that the background, which may be a long distance behind them, feels like it's right next to them. So this is how we know it's a very wide lens. With that also taken into account, and actually another thing to see is how he walks off frame. If you notice how he walks off frame, he is right next to the lens, and yet he still feels like you're getting a lot of him in there. The other thing that is interesting about this, and mind you, these are only guesses that I'm going on here, because I really do not know anything about the lens data, which is the focal length, the lens height, or the angle, which are all very, very important in doing this kind of work traditionally. But given the fact that we don't have any of that information, we're just going to give it our best shot and work with it the best we can. But having said that, the other thing that I'm seeing is not a ton of distortion on the sides. With really wide lenses, traditionally, they have quite a bit of curvature, so it feels more circular on the outside. And here, this is very straight. And also the other side, the other thing that I was noticing is the kind of the aspect that we're seeing. So with that, I have a feeling that we are seeing a 14 millimeter lens, which Canon makes, which has little or no distortion. Admittedly, we ran the lens distortion node, so I will qualify that with the fact that there is some distortion, but not so much that you can really see what's going on here. So now that I've said that, let's say we have a 14 millimeter lens, and also looking at where the lens, basically the center of the lens is aiming in terms of the height, I would say right around where this guy's belly is. It's pretty similar to probably this camera here in terms of where its pedestal is. And I would estimate this right around 125 centimeters from the ground. Once again, these are all guesses, but that's my feeling. And so with that in mind, let's now go back to Nuke and try to create a camera that accurately represents what I just said. So with my hypothesis in mind, let's go ahead and set it up correctly. So 50 millimeters with a 35 millimeter camera, if you're used to shooting film, is your standard one-on-one lens, and I estimated it to be a 14 millimeter lens. So everything else I'm going to leave the same because essentially that's what should be the case. Then the next thing we wanted to do is set up the height of the lens, which I guessed at about 125 centimeters. And of course, immediately as we did that, we now start to see a little bit of a ground plane. The other thing that I want to do is maybe pull the camera back so that we see, because currently the camera head is right on the origin, and we want to go ahead and pull back so that it feels like the camera is more behind where it's at, if that makes sense. And once again, there right there is the origin. And maybe we'll start fudging with these numbers here in a minute. And then the other thing that we need to remember is that the camera head is actually tilted to the ground slightly. So let's see what happens. And certainly you can see that that's evident in this particular camera. Not that these two cameras are exactly the same, because I'm sure they aren't, but at least this will give us a sense as to whether or not it feels right. So if we start to tilt the head down, now this is starting to feel a bit like a ground plane, and quite frankly, this feels pretty good. I don't know if it's right, but it feels reasonable. And if we were to set this up, maybe another couple degrees. Yeah, honestly, yeah, this feels almost better. Or what is this? 8 degrees? What does 9 feel like? So once again, a lot of guesswork here, and hopefully it will pay off. It feels like the direction will take us so that the clipping plane goes to infinity right around in here somewhere. And actually, let's see if we can fix that, which is the projection. Is that right? Wait. Yep, here it is, the far clipping plane. So let's see if this, it doesn't seem to make a difference. Let me see. Well, one of the things you may have noticed is we're in 3D space, and we're actually viewing the plate in 2D, which if you were curious as to why that is, that's a good question. And if you notice here, we have this lock to camera view set, which is what is enabling us to do that. But actually, there's also one other thing that you need to know, which is to actually view 2D imagery in the 3D space. The only node that I know of that allows you to do that is the Model Builder. So this is actually a feature set of the Model Builder node that kind of allows us to set this stuff up. Now that we actually have this, what I'm going to do is step out. and go into the camera settings and just watch the camera frustum and actually make sure that it actually extends when we actually set our clipping plane to go further. It's not. Okay. So I just need to stop 1 second and figure out why that's not working. So as it turns out, I just needed to zoom in or zoom out a little bit so that we actually saw the edge of the camera frustum. And so now when we adjust this, it does actually pull it out significantly. And the other thing that is interesting to me is that it doesn't seem, I guess, if we look at the origin and now look through the camera, okay, yeah, no, that's fine. We don't need to do this. And actually, I think maybe these grids are actually terminating prematurely because we have no geometry in here to make them continue. So we'll leave it at that. And now let's go with the next step, which is actually creating that geometry. So now that we've done this, let's just go ahead and hit the lock to camera view. And let's start creating a piece of geo using the model builder. I'm gonna continue to break these away from the control panel because I feel like it's a little more helpful when we have some more screen real estate, especially with stuff like this. So if you haven't used the model builder, this is a new model builder in Nuke 7, and it's pretty cool. It is not the easiest node to use, but it is certainly worth going through a little bit of it. The first thing that we want to do is create a card, which we'll then establish on the ground plane. There's multiple ways to do this, but mind you, we're going to do this in a very unconventional way just because this is one of those rare cases where you have no lens data, a camera lock off, and so you're kind of left up to your own devices to just kind of guesswork all of this. But I feel like it's certainly good to try it and get the most out of it. So once we have this, you can actually create a card a couple of ways. One is you can hit this modify tool and then set this to card. And then by doing so, you can just literally just drag. Well, you should be able to. Let's try this again. No. Why is that not? Maybe you need to have select objects set. No. Okay. Not sure. Well, okay. That being said, let me do it the other way, which I do know works. And that'll be this, where you hit the create card. Then when you click and drag, you will be left with a card that should work. Now that we have that, typically a lot of the workflow goes to working in align mode. Align mode works, and essentially that allows us to, set the value. So we would set this to what we feel is like the clipping plane, and then take this somewhere like this and put this one in here like this, and it starts to feel like we're actually establishing a ground plane when we do this. The problem in doing it this way is that this is actually not accurate at all. We know good and well that this camera is a lock off, so we're not going to have any parallax information, and that's what helps Shake determine the actual height and all that from the lens. Since we don't have any lens data, which subsequently that means no point cloud data or anything like that, this is not really going to work. So what we'll do now that I've done this is we'll probably just redo this, but we're going to step out of the lock view mode one more time, and we're going to go into the edit mode, and we're going to edit having the object selected. When you do that, of course, it brings up all your transforms that we're used to. And we can see right away that this is completely away from the ground plane. So let's just go ahead and set this essentially at this origin here of the ground plane. And actually, I'm going to kind of shrink things up a little bit here so we can kind of work. And so now that we have this, let's do that. And what I do to kind of determine whether or not something's set at the ground plane. Also, if you noticed, I'm jumping to a view that is right next to the object. I'm just hitting the F key. That's actually Very useful when you're working with geometry. If you want to rotate something or you want to rotate your camera around something, if you hit the F key, it allows you to rotate and operate around that object. So this is actually a pretty useful thing to know. And now we can see right away that this is still way above the ground plane. And what I tend to do is just circle around the object. That also helps determine. And let's pull this up right around here and maybe drop this down. Now we're just above the ground plane, and we will set it down right there. I think that that's pretty accurate. And one more time, let's just move this. So now it feels like we're really established at the origin. No reason in particular to set it right at the origin right now, only just so that it gives us a bearing for when we try to start lining this up a little bit more. Now, the next thing that I've done, next thing that we need to do is kind of scale this up. So if you hold your shift and your command key and you just hit scale, we're going to draw from the yellow anchor point. It will scale it up. And now we can start to make it so that it feels like it's actually large enough to work as a ground plane. And now if we click on this camera, it should send us to the camera view, which it's doing. And also let's go back to our default view and frame to the card. And also let's just rotate this so that it is actually kind of lining up with what we saw earlier with this grid in the world space. So that feels decent. Admittedly, this is, kind of shooting in the dark, but I think that feels pretty good. Now that we've done that, let's hit the lock to camera view and see and also click on the camera and see how that looks. So that looks pretty good. Now what we do know is that we want this ground plane to essentially extend for a ways and onto the floor. But because we know that the car actually falls right around in this area. So let's see, can I grab? Nope. Okay, so now that I've done that, we got to step out one more time. And we'll go here and pull this back away from the camera. Another thing that you can do with 3D objects in the 3D view is if you hold, I think it's the Command and Control or Apple key, you can now move your anchor point around, and you can also rotate your anchor point so that in this case we're looking at the Z-axis is going up, and basically these are oriented wrong to the camera. So if I hold the Option, Command, and then the Shift key, now I think I should be able to rotate this so that the Z is now pointed to the camera, which it seems like it's doing pretty well. And now, okay, and then also let's see, I guess that actually looks spot on. Okay, so yeah, and actually the other side of it is that this is swung around the wrong way, I guess, because technically the X should be on that side, but it doesn't really matter. Anyway, that being said, now if we go back to our view here, if we push our ground plane to what we feel is way off in Z space, hopefully this is going to work. So yeah. And honestly, looking at this, I'm feeling like the camera needs to be tilted down a little bit more because this feels a little bit high as far as a horizon line. So now that I've done that, let me just go ahead and tilt the camera down until it feels a little bit more right. So, okay. Let's see here, camera, let's tilt. I think that the ground should be right about there. That to me feels better. So what is that, 11 degrees? Okay. All right, now that we have this, let's go ahead and finish. What I'm going to do is just finish moving this around, scaling it up so that the center of this card is right over here. And since I don't want to take up too much time on the video just going through all those movements, I think you probably know how to align that stuff in the 3D space. I will stop down and come back. On second thought, I just realized that I didn't actually talk about some of the other facets with the model builder, which is how you would go about extending this ground plane out. So if you right click, you'll notice that you have face selection, vertex selection, and so on, edge selection. So in this case, if we actually go to edge selection and click and extend all these, we can now take this edge and actually extend it all the way to where the camera is. Once again, if we come back here, now you can see that the edge is actually being extended properly, to where we wanted it to be. And, you know, once again, I can just pull this up, and why don't we just move it up to roughly here. Now it starts to feel a little bit more like our ground plane is. And then the other side, or the other thing we can do is start scaling it out. Excuse me. I meant to leave the lock camera view, and then we can scale this out away from the camera. And one thing I'm also noticing is that this obviously did lift from the ground plane at some point, and I'm not sure what time that happened. So we'll just go ahead and click on this, go back to object selection, and bring this down to the actual ground plane itself. But yeah, also I had mentioned something about being able to take the anchor point and move it around. So if we wanted to move it back here and then run our scale in, like, for example, the X direction. Oh yeah, okay. Well, this, by the way, is another thing that I've run into with the model builder. Sometimes when you start editing the piece of geometry and you go into scale mode, it only scales like the smallest increment is huge. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and go to edge selection one more time and click on these. There's another thing you can do, which is select edge loop, but I don't think it works on the outside edge. But what that typically does is it selects everything along the loop of the everything on the outside edge. So, like, let's see if I can do it one more time. We'll try. No. And then there's also this select edge ring, which will select everything around in a ring-like fashion. The edge loop just gives you the line. So I think actually if I were to select this one here internally and then click on select edge loop, it'll select, yes, exactly. So then you can select the entire thing. But in our case, we want this. So it looks like shift selecting all of these is the way we'll have to do that. And now we can extend this a little ways out and do the same for this one as well. And I can see that I'm having some difficulty getting the right edges, so it's going to take a little while. So now that I've shown you those things, I'm going to go ahead and stop down like I said I would, and come back when I have this essentially set up as a true ground plane. So now that we have our ground plane set up, the next thing we want to do is actually switch over to the green screen plate, and let's go ahead and create our cube that represents the car. Okay, so here we are. At this point, I have now lined up this card to basically line up where the impact zone is of the car and the bottom of the green screen here. One thing that's helpful to note is that while we have this car moving down in space, it's nice to see that the cube is actually lining up with relative perspective, working pretty well throughout the shot. Since we're guessing all of this, it's it's going to be very difficult to get it spot on. But for our purposes of getting the particles to work correctly, and also anything else we might do using this card and the ground plane, this looks pretty good. So now that we've done that, let's move on to the next thing, which is actually creating those particles. And I just really realized, that I almost forgot to address one last very important part of the model builder, which is how you export the geometry. So when you have this graph, when you look at this graph, if you select the piece of geometry that you want, we can call this, you can name it whatever you want, obviously, like anything else. We'll call it cube, car, and then card, we'll name that ground plane. So there we go. So now once we do this, the next step is to actually bake it. So the important thing is the impact, which is frame 31. So that's what I'm going to bake it from. As soon after hitting that, you can see right away it creates a piece of geometry and named appropriately. And we're also going to do that with the ground plane as well. So now that we have our two pieces of geo, now let's get started on creating the particles. So with the particles, one of the things that you have is these presets here. And these are really cool and a great starting place when you're trying to create stuff that's useful. Now you can go ahead and build these things through the particle system here by starting with an emitter and then controlling how those particles react to various temporal property maps or ephemeral property maps, or you can actually start it just by doing it from here, which is what I like to do. So I'm going to create this dust hit, and from here it's important to kind of see how this works. So let me set up real quick, just set up so we can actually look at the dust hit in its properties, because we've already done all this work on the camera that's not going to work necessarily with this dust hit right out of the gate. So give me 1 second and I'll return. Okay, so you can see now I've got this dust hit that's actually looks really cool just out of the gate. Now that I've shown you this from this perspective, let me just show you how zoomed in and how small this is compared to our world space. So you see how relative that is. Let me show you the ground plane of our cube. So the dust hit by default comes in extremely small and you can't see it right away until you actually zoom in. With that being said, let's go ahead and step out of this and actually start setting up this dust hit properly. So currently it's emitting from a cylinder. You can also do it from a plane, and you can also do it from a custom input, which in our case, I've connected our custom input to the geo here, the geo input. Then the next thing that we need to do is actually hit this little S like icon, which gives us the properties and the actual gizmo as it was created. So when you look at this, you'll notice it's a little scary in terms of all the stuff that it has going on in here, but that's okay. So just to explain very quickly what it is, this here is a sprite. It's basically the particle that was created, which is essentially a noise in a rotor shape to make it look like a piece of dust. That's being fed into the emitter in the particle end here. So it says, okay, this is what we're going to be emitting. And it goes from there. Then you have the geometry from which those particles are being emitted from. So if we went back to the property settings, you'll notice this here, these inputs are the same as this switch right here. So it gives us either the geometry, which is custom input, card, or cylinder. And then here, this is actually allows you to plug an axis into it. So if you notice, there's an axis input. So if we wanted to actually center it around something like this, for example, and we wanted to scale it up around that, that's how we would go ahead and set those things up. Now that we've gone through some of that, let's just go ahead and start tweaking on this and see if we can get some geometry or some particles to show up now that we see this. Mind you, another thing that I want to do really quick is just go ahead and turn off the display to wireframe so it's not getting in the way of us being able to see what's going on. So where it says here in the properties of the dust hit, gizmo, you can see that its start frame is 5. So if we get a frame 6, that will be basically where we see the greatest amount of dust, so to speak. And actually, we can't even zoom in too well. Oh, actually, we've already mapped it to the cube. So now that we've done that, let me just show you what my next step is just to turn off all these additional properties around the particles, because really what we want to do is see this particle system that comes in here and just see it out of the emitter and make sure everything's working correctly on the geometry. So now that we've done that, if we disable all of that, there we go, then we should be able to start seeing it. Now, the reason why we're not seeing it right yet is because if you notice here in the start size, it's less than a value of 1. And we were in fairly large world space values. And so the only way we're going to be able to see this is just by, let's just multiply that by 100. So immediately now, as soon as we do that, you can see right away that we have something going on. And basically it doesn't do much because it's also moving in the relative direction to the size, which is, if you look at the emit velocity, it's very, very, very low. So let's go ahead and take that up to like 10, for example. And that's still not doing a heck of a lot. So at this point, this is where we have to start tweaking on some of these settings. So I'm going to go ahead and, oh, actually, there's one other thing that I needed to address. So in the properties here of the of this gizmo here, you have your emitter properties. Now, when you look at the properties here, you can see that it's kind of a lot of stuff going on, but more importantly, it's emitting from the points in randomly no direction. So what I would like to do is just set this to faces. And of course, as soon as we do that, this changes radically. And let's see what happens if we do to the outward direction. So now that we've done this, you can see right away that we're starting to get something that's looking a little bit better. And so having done that, let's see what we can do to adjust the dust tip properties a little bit. Its gravity multiplier is set to, oh, wait a minute. Are we not seeing it through the camera? Oh, that's because we're not actually looking through the camera. So here, let's just create a scene node. And this will the only thing it's going to do for us is just allow us to see everything that happens to be connected in here. So now that we have this, if we go to the camera 1, we can kind of see what we're looking at. That being said, I would say that probably our start size might be a little large, but I don't know for sure. We still need to turn on all these subsequent properties of the emitter to really get a sense of what it feels like. Immediately, as soon as we do that, the opacity and everything else seems to change pretty radically. You can see very faint particles coming through here. So it looks like we're getting something that's feeling pretty good. And at this point, I think we should probably just assemble this and see what it looks like on the plate and see if we're getting something that we want. One last note about the particle emitter that is useful is that down at the bottom here you have the color of the particles, and that's probably going to be pretty useful when we try to nest that into the background plate. And actually, one also not last, but let's go here to the scanline render. At this point, if we step out of, oops, okay, we're going to have to come back in a few moments. Okay, here we are looking at the particles just with everything turned off, just so that way we can see kind of what's going on. In this particular case, this is in 2D view, so we can see right away how it's looking. I think if I move this around, it's going to start to redraw it, as I was just saying. And so I'm going to stop this down now. The next step that what we need to do is actually here, if we turn these off, you can see right away how it starts to change the look and everything. Now you'll notice that you can see the cube through the dust particles, and realistically, if we were to disconnect the cube from the scene, we will actually not have that showing up. So if you don't want that to show up in your final render, you just turn that off. Now that we've done this, I would say the next step is to kind of go through tweaking these so that we can tweak the opacity level and that sort of thing. If you look at the Gizmo pipeline here, and you see it lays out very clearly what all the things do in its process. And one thing that I do want to mention about this gizmo is that I've found that the start opacity makes absolutely no difference. So if I were to set this to 1, you'll see that it doesn't change in the alpha channel. It changes nothing, and nor does it change it on the foreground either. So in this particular case, what I'm going to end up doing is actually removing this from the equation, because it does do something, but it doesn't seem to be responding appropriately. So what I'm going to do is now create my own by adding a curve to it. So if we go over here and we go to, what is it? Particle curve, I think. And we connect this up. You'll see right away we have all these options here, which are much simpler to operate. And we know that we want to adjust the alpha channel. So if we take this down, and mind you, we're looking in the alpha channel here. If we take this down, we should see right away a change in the value. Oh, we should actually hook this up. And this is actually over the life of a particle. So if we were to take this down to 0 now, it'll fade off, and we can get a sense of how to make it work. So basically these particles currently are set. If we one more time go back to the properties of the actual gizmo, they have a life of 25 frames. We can, I think that that's a little long, so why don't we take this down to a little less than half, and you'll start to see, especially now, if we go, you'll see these things are starting to fade off like they're supposed to. So I'm going to go ahead and tweak some of these settings and see what we can get. Also, some of this turbulence and gravity, I'm also finding that the gravity doesn't respond quite the way I would want it to, but in our particular case, it's not really going to be a big deal, because it does, just out of the gate, how this is set up, it seems to operate pretty well, so we may not need to tweak any of that. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop down and then start setting up everything so that I feel like it looks pretty good, and I'll even change the color. And then we'll see how it is nested in with the plate and go from there. Okay, so here we are. This is what I've been able to create just by adjusting some things on the particles. They seem to nest in reasonably well. I can see right away that they're a little heavy-handed, and also I think the die-off needs to happen a little sooner. So this is something that perhaps you guys can take from here. With that being said, let's go ahead and step into the script, and I can show you a few things that were changed. So if we go here into the dust hit, one of the things that I decided to do is turn off this opacity fall off, because I felt like it was competing with our curve that we had set before. So this here, let's just go ahead and rename this particle curve opacity. So this here, if you remember, we basically just set this to die off. Now I think that it probably would need to die off a little sooner. And then of course I set the color of the emitter down here in the emitter properties for the dust as well. So that could stand to maybe be a little bit darker. And with that said, essentially everything else that I did was pretty much the same, except one major thing, which was the life. I experimented around with that a little bit, and I decided to have it last a little longer. It seems like it's still holding out a little too long, but that could be controlled by the opacity on the part of the curve node that I just showed you. That being said, that's essentially the particles. And I did one other thing that I wanted to show, which was that I took over here, I took our geometry. So this is here is the cube. If we go ahead and step into this, you'll see what we have here. I decided to create a shadow from the car, the cube of the car. So essentially, if we zoom out of here, you can see that what I created was a spotlight, which then was designed to cast a shadow onto the ground plane. Now, I'm texturing the ground plane with a checkerboard and all that, but ultimately what we're doing is we are using, I created a new layer set called Shadowcaster here, which basically is just the shadow. So let's look at the properties of this. Essentially, the model build, the what do you call it? The cube that's supposed to represent the car. I went ahead and animated it along with the car, so it kind of bounces on the ground. Just hand keyframed it, and then from there, I've set it so that it's designed to cast and receive shadows. The more important side is actually the light itself. So the light was positioned just by looking through the model builder node and seeing how to set it up. I basically positioned it in roughly the same place that the lights were in the actual plate. And then in here for shadows, what I did is I clicked this cast shadows and set this on with full alpha. But then what I did is created this output mask, which was Shadowcaster, which is what's coming out of the scanline render node here. With that in mind, let's see, I think, I dialed in the intensity a little bit and the cone angle just to get what I felt was an adequate shadow. And then here, I just went ahead and added the softening to the shadow so that it was, it felt a little nicer in the, the edges weren't so hard, so it felt like it was a little bit more natural. So if we look at the output of this and actually look at the Shadowcaster layer set, you'll see that we now have this nice shadow fall off. From there, I actually also, whoops, not grab that. I decided to take a Luma key from the dark areas of the screen. So if you were to look at this, and let's go back to RGB, you'll see that I decided to take the kind of the shadow areas that on the ground itself, and I held those out in a rotor shape like so. So this is basically the shadow area that I was trying to preserve, and then, blurred it slightly. And from there, I converted that to the Shadowcaster layer set as well, and then added those two together. And then from there, this here is a grade node, which is the shadow on the background plate. So essentially, we were able to create something that looked a little nicer. And actually, this was a preliminary shadow that I started doing just from the key. But essentially, this is what we have now. So if you look at the output, you'll see that we now have this shadow that animates correctly the way we would expect, and it feels starting to feel pretty good. So I would invite you to play around a little bit with some of the sparks and that sort of thing if you want to try some other particles. So if you wanted to add some sparks coming off of here, you could certainly do that. I think that I've shown you a pretty comprehensive idea of how you can use geometry now placed in space that matches up pretty well with the plate, so that if you wanted to do other things, you could start doing that with some of the particles. And with that being said, I think that's all I have for this. It's obviously a little longer than I had anticipated, but hopefully it's a lot of valuable information. So Any questions, feel free to hit me up on the forums, and certainly play around with this script, look at what I've done, and that's all I have. So have a great week, and I will see you next week. Thanks so much.